Okay, so this is an article I wrote for the Journal of Contemporary Society several years ago when I was still Rebbe in MTA, so earlier than 2016. I don't remember exactly which year it was published, but sometime before that. And it's a question which always intrigued me, so when I'm intrigued by a question, I like writing an article about it, which is, may you invite for Shabbos? I think it's kind of explanatory. Somebody may desecrate the Shabbos to attend. In other words, you're inviting somebody who's not Shomer Shabbos to your house for Shabbos, for a meal, and presumably they're going to drive to get to your house on Shabbos and drive away. So is this permitted or not? Of course, this can take place in many, many settings, as we shall see when we start getting into the various different cases. So it's important to understand this in the context of the various different decades in which this question was asked. This question really first started being asked in the 1950s, and it's still asked today, 70 some odd years later. And the context has changed, as we're going to come to later on when we get into the nitty-gritty. The context of the question is not the same today as when the question was asked in the 1950s. So what's the difference? So we're going to start with a few of the questions as asked in the 1950s, and the first one here, although not chronologically, first we're going to discuss is a question asked by... There's a question asked by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, the famous Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. At the time, he was a very young rabbi in Louisville, Kentucky. And he was the rabbi, he was actually a teacher in a non-Orthodox school. There were two schools in Louisville at the time, an Orthodox school and a non-denominational school. And he was a teacher in the non-denominational school. And the question was, they wanted to hold in that school an educational prayer service for members of the community, for children who would clearly drive to the school on Shabbos for the purpose of this session, this prayer service. So the question was, can we actually invite people to come to daven, knowing that there will be Mechal Shabbos under the come? So Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan asked Rav Moshe Feinstein the question, and the response is actually published in the Igros Moshe. And Rav Moshe says, it is clearly not permissible, even if the children are not bar mitzvah age, for the people to be driven for the kids to be driven to the prayer service on Shabbos. Because obviously, he says, education to daven, which is a very beautiful thing, does not take precedence over education for Shabbos. Chilul Shabbos cannot be justified to teach people how to participate in davening. So therefore, he says that it is absolutely prohibited to have such a prayer service, and which is the exact opposite of its purpose. It's supposed to be mechanech for mitzvahs, but in fact, it's being mechanech for averos. And now Rav Moshe was not. Rav Moshe had no illusions. He said that in all probability, they're not going to listen to what Rabbi Kaplan has to say. They're not going to disband the prayer service. But nevertheless, Rabbi Kaplan should consistently expound on the severity of Chilul Shabbos and take every advantage of that opportunity to speak out against this concept, and also to try and get as many people to come on foot as possible. And so Moshe says, if Rabbi Kaplan does this, he will fulfill the mitzvah of tochacha, which tochacha means to tell a person who's committing an avera, don't commit the avera. And perhaps this will be of some benefit. Now, up to the bottom of page 2, by the way, in the handout. Now, this question was asked in 1956. In 1953, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked a similar question, which is 3 years earlier, by Reb Naftali Carlebach of Detroit. Now, I don't know, Reb Naftali Carlebach was the name of the singer of Shlomo Carlebach's father. I don't know if it's the same Reb Naftali Carlebach. Could be, but the Carlebach family was and is an illustrious German Jewish rabbinic family, and it could be one of the other Carlebachs, but it's nice to think of it as being Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach's father. So he at the time was this Rabbi Naftali Carlebach was a mechanech in Beis Yehuda in Detroit. He was a teacher in the Orthodox day school. He also had been a rabbi of a shul. He gave up the rabbinate because he had some relative who had no parnasa, and he gave the shul up to this rabbi who had no parnasa. But a similar situation came in the shul where he was still a member. So they wanted to make Rabbi Carlebach wanted to know if you're allowed to invite somebody to come daven in shul on Shabbos, knowing they're going to come by car and they're going to desecrate the Shabbos. Now, it used to be this in the Midwest, not in Detroit necessarily, so much as in Chicago, but in the Midwest there was a trend in the 30s, 40s, 50s to set up shuls which are called traditional synagogues. They don't really exist anymore. There was a very much a failed experiment. But the idea, which was promoted by the Rosh Yeshiva of first the Chicago and then the Skokie Yeshiva, the Hebrew Theological College, was that, you know what, assimilation is horrible and it's going on and there's not much we can do to save people from it. So therefore, at least let's make synagogues where they're going to keep davening of an Orthodox prayer. They use the Birnbaum Siddur, they use a Frum Siddur, or something similar. Even though we're going to have mixed seating, and we're going to have parking lots open on Shabbos. So, nevertheless, the fact, at least we'll save some people that way. And that was the cheshbon. Ultimately, it was a failed experiment because people people either left altogether or they decided this is not authentic, and they went. Far fewer people went and became Orthodox as a result. And today there are almost no traditional synagogues left. There are very few. Yes.
They will not mixed seating, but not to come to Shabbos with a car?
No, they'll allow people to come to Shabbos by car as well. The Rav wouldn't come by Shabbos by car.
But he was not that you come to shul at least to have something.
Yes. It's like a Tzala Purta. Someone of us you're saving something. No. Came out of Chicago, not out of New York. In fact, what actually Certain Rabbanim allowed it, yes. In fact, the alternative to this, which was actually much more successful, was the Young Israel movement. The Young Israel movement was very successful out of town in keeping Jews from, and they didn't tolerate mixed seating or driving to shul on Shabbos. So ultimately, that proved to be the better solution than the traditional synagogue. But the OU over the years had a policy of allowing traditional synagogues to be members of the OU, even though they had mixed seating and their parking lots over on Shabbos. As the years went by, they pressured these synagogues either to change or to actually leave the OU. And I don't know if there are any left today. Once they were, until 10 years ago, so there were, but I don't know if there are any left today. But be as it may, so in Detroit, this is a shul which still had separate seating. It still had mechitza, and it still had, obviously, from davening. I shall tell you on a tangent. There was a famous case in the shul in not in Detroit, but in the suburb of Detroit, Mount St. Clemens, which was a case study where the congregation went conservative, and they wanted to eliminate the mechitza. And one congregant stood up and said, "No, the bylaws of the shul say that this is an Orthodox shul, right? So therefore, they have to keep the mechitza." And it went to court, became a huge court case. And the Orthodox congregant won the case. And there was a whole book they put out at the time called The Sanctity of the Synagogue, and you can still buy it today. Still put out by the descendants of this fellow. Unfortunately, it was kind of an empty gesture because they kept the mechitza because of the court order until he died. And the moment he died, they dropped the mechitza. So obviously that's what was going on. What was going on in America in the hinterlands in those days was a tremendous and often losing battle against the winds of assimilation. So one of the things that they thought it was important to come to shul. And again, often a bit of a tangent. The thing which finally separated conservative Judaism from Orthodox Judaism totally in the mid-1950s was the Pesach, which the conservative movement gave, which is that you're allowed to drive to shul on Shabbos. Right? And that you're not allowed, theoretically, you're not allowed to drive anywhere else. Right? And I know today a conservative rabbi who will drive to shul on Shabbos, but she says she won't fill up gas on Shabbos. That she won't do, and she doesn't play the radio when she's in the car on Shabbos. So but everyone makes their own strange compromises. This is a very strange one, but Lamaisa, this was the conservative movement paskin, so to speak. That's pikuach nefesh ruchani. It's a spiritual pikuach nefesh for Jews to come to shul on Shabbos. Because they don't come to shul on Shabbos, they're going to be assimilated, they're going to be gone. So therefore, it's better for them to drive, if that's the way they're going to come to shul on Shabbos, than to stay home and not go to shul. So of course, we don't hold that way. We hold that that's absurd. You're not Mechal Shabbos in order to come shul. If your Yiddish guy is a problem, it's a problem. But you're not going to resolve it by having people drive to shul on Shabbos. That's just a distortion, a absolute farce. So in this case, it was the Frum shul, and they were inviting people to come to daven and shul on Shabbos. It was clear that these people who are going to come to daven and shul on Shabbos are going to actually be Mechal Shabbos. They're going to drive in order to get there. So the question is whether this was permitted or not, and the issue was Lifnei Iver. Now let's talk about Lifnei Iver for a moment. Lifnei Iver is the prohibition of causing somebody to violate a prohibition. The classic case of Lifnei Iver Lo Titei Mishul, as described by the Gemara, is you have a Nazir, somebody's now allowed to drink wine, and you give him a cup of wine, which he's going to drink. And that's called Lifnei Iver, in front of the blind person. The Nazir, Lo Titei Mishul, don't put a stumbling block. What's a stumbling block? The cup of wine. Now, the Gemara says there are two levels of Lifnei Iver. One is Doraisa. Doraisa is if you have a cup of wine which the Nazir could not access otherwise, and you give it to him, that's Lifnei Iver Doraisa. It's the total level prohibition of Lifnei Iver. And that's called, the Gemara calls it Trei Iver Dinahara. If the Nazir is on one side of the river, the wine is on the other side of the river, you ferry the wine over to him and give him the cup of wine, that's Lifnei Iver Doraisa. That's a total prohibition. He had no access, you gave him the access, that's Lifnei Iver. What happens if he could have accessed it himself? What the Gemara calls Chad Iver Dinahara, where the wine and the Nazir are both on the same side of the river. So in that case, he says, that's not, the Chazal say, that's not considered Lifnei Iver Doraisa, that's called Misayeya Yedei Over Avera. Helping people to do Averis, and that's only Issa D'Rabbanan. It's prohibited, but it's a rabbinic prohibition. They're both prohibited. Again, whether the wine was accessible to the Nazir or wasn't accessible to the Nazir, he can't give it to the Nazir. But one is a Torah prohibition, Lifnei Iver Lo Titei Mishul, and the other is a rabbinic prohibition, a Misayeya Yedei Over Avera. Okay, so now these are two different levels of prohibition, but they're both usher. So the question, but Rav Moshe comes up with a chiddush, and then now we're on page 3 towards the bottom, area number 4. Rav Moshe has a mind-boggling chiddush. Rav Moshe was a tremendous mechadish, and he says, you know what? There's another prohibition here to take into account, and that prohibition to take account is maces. Now maces umeidiach are people who come and try and persuade you to serve Avodah Zarah. And the Torah has particularly strong words to say about a maces. Even though most people commit averos and try not to put them to death, a maces you're supposed to not be malamed choy. You're supposed to try and find as many points of guilt for them as possible. And you're supposed to try and do as much as possible to impose the death penalty on them. So that is very counter to what our normal, so to speak, Jewish values are. In the case of a maces, we make sure to try and do away with them as much as possible. Now, what's Rav Moshe's chiddush? The Torah itself says that a maces, it seems to talk about maces in Pashut Shem Sugim as somebody who's trying to convince somebody else to be Ovid Avodah Zarah. They come and they say to you, Habal hu Elokim, right? Go worship the Baal. Let's come worship the Baal with me, right? So that's called the maces in the Torah. But Moshe comes to a tremendous chiddush, and he says, any Aveira that I try and persuade another person to do gives me the status of a maces. If I come and I tell you, hey, come on, let's go eat some treif. Let's go to McDonald's together. Let's have a cheeseburger together. So then that, according to Moshe, is also called a maces, because I'm trying to convince somebody to do an avodah zarah, right? So it's a very tremendous chiddush. Again, the way we understand maces until Rav Moshe Feinstein is that it's specifically somebody who tries to persuade another Jew as a missionary. So somebody who tries to persuade another Jew to be Avodah Avodah Zarah. Well, then comes Rav Moshe and says, I'll prove to you not that way. He says, from where do we learn that ein mahapchim b'zchuso shamesis? From where do we know that we don't try and find some extenuating circumstances for this person who's a maces, who's trying to proselytize somebody else to do to commit an avera? Gemara says from the Nachash, from the serpent in Gan Eden. The serpent tried to persuade Achav and Adam to eat from the tree, and the Torah says that he was cursed. And Chazal say, yeah, but wait a minute, there was a limud zchus on the Nachash. It was something we could have said as an extenuating circumstance for him. What could we have said? So the Gemara says, we could have said that the Nachash could have countered Divrei Rav, Divrei Talmud, Divrei Mishomim. Who are you going to, if Hashem tells you not to do something, you're going to listen to the serpent? The Rebbe tells you not to do something, you're going to listen to the student who tells you to do it? It's not my fault that Adam and Chava sinned. They should have realized this is an absurd situation. So the Gemara says, no. We don't, even though that's legitimate assertion, would have been a legitimate assertion on Nachash's behalf, and normally we would try for some other type of capital crime to find some limud zchus, some sort of merit for the person who otherwise he put to death. In the case of the basis, we don't do that, and that's why the Nachash was cursed. So Moshe says, wait a minute, what was the sin that the Nachash tried to get Adam and Chava to commit? It was to eat from the Eitz Hadas. Eat from the Eitz Hadas is not avodah zarah. So therefore, we see that a maces is anybody who tries to persuade a person to commit an avera, even not specifically an avera avodah zarah. Now that in itself is a matter of big controversy, because in fact, many Achrayim and some Rishonim hold that. What did Nachash say? He said the reason why Hashem doesn't want to eat from the tree is because then for Yisem Kelohim Yodei Tovara. So it sounds like he was telling them to do an Avera of Avodah Zarah. Right? He says, right, there's only one God. You also want to be gods. Eat from the tree, you'll also be gods. So that is a form of Avodah Zarah, right? Making themselves into other gods. Rachmana litzlan. But Ramosha doesn't learn that way. Ramosha says that, again, what he really was trying to do was just to get them to eat from the tree, not to make themselves of Avodah Zarah. That could have been perhaps a drash in the pasuk, but it's not pushing in the pasuk. So therefore, Moshe says that the issue here is an issue which is actually much more severe than lifnei iver. If you urge people to come daven on Shabbos by driving, you're a maces. It's a terrible categorization to be in. Now, Ramosha, of course, says lifnei iver applies as well. But it's interesting because he says that lifnei iver apply normally. What he said before is when it's treif denara, you don't have access to otherwise the person not have access to the sin. So what about here, where let's say a person could have let's say a person could have walked to shul. He could have walked. He's 5 minutes away, but he's going to drive. Is it lifnei iver d'oraisa the rabbanan? So if it's up to me, I would say it's only the rabbanan. We say they're very, very helping to the avera, not compelling him to the avera, not finding access to the avera in a way which otherwise would not have had, because he could have walked in any event. I'm not making him drive to shul. Somebody says no. If you know he's going to drive to shul, you can't invite him to come, and it's lifnei iver d'oraisa. You know why? Because the fact you're inviting him to come to a prayer service, which otherwise he wouldn't come to, that in of itself is giving access to something which would not be accessible otherwise. But don't tell him about the prayer service. Yes, he lives 5 minutes away, but you know he's going to drive like any good American, right? Well, I know I have a shul down a block from me. Of course, I drive there. It saves me 2 minutes. I don't have to walk. So, like any good American, we all drive to the shul if we get to drive to shul. So, therefore, you're putting a stumbling block in his way, which is d'oraisa, by saying there's a prayer service to which I want you to come to. So, Moshe, even that's lifnei iver d'oraisa. Okay, so then Moshe asks, now we're on page 5, by the way, towards the bottom of page 5. You obviously have 4 pages per page there, but about page number, page 5. What about if you put up a generic notice that announces the existence of a prayer service and that prizes will be distributed to anyone who attends? Okay, so Moshe says, even though it's generic, it doesn't say who should come and who shouldn't come. It says to just come and get a prize. He says that also perhaps is lifnei iver as well. He's not sure. He says it's not clear if an announcement is the same as an invitation. But in any event, it was similar enough that you can't post such a notice in shul. He says if you post it, you have to make it clear that the prizes will only be distributed to people who walk to shul. which probably would be very controversial. But he says you can't. There's no other way to do it. Now, okay, so we have these two truths from Moshe which are in the 1950s. The one to Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan and one to Rabbi Naftali Karabach, and they both have to do, again, with the state of affairs in Judaism in America in the 1950s. And bear in mind, getting back to something we said before, there was a famous conservative Jewish sociologist, Marshall Sklar, who wrote a whole book about how Orthodox Judaism is on the verge of disappearing from the face of the earth. Just give it a few years and Orthodox Judaism is going away. Right? So we're in a very precarious position at the time. But we'll come back to that in a few moments. It's interesting that footnote 12, Rabbi Karabach was asked actually, maybe I should just resign from the shul. So he said, Rabbi Moshe told him, no, don't resign, because perhaps you're going to be able to admonish people not to come on Shabbos, and maybe somebody's going to listen to you. Who knows? He says that, and the footnote he qualifies, however, that's only true if there's no change being made in the shul itself, meaning the mechitza is not being removed or the manner of davening is not going to be changed. If that happens, then everybody who's the Yerei Shemayim is going to have to resign their membership in the shul. But as long as that doesn't happen, stay there. Maybe you're going to be able to achieve some benefit. Okay, so now we're skipping in section 5 on page 6, way ahead, 30 years later. 35 years later. It's 1988. So in 1988, one of the Rosh Yeshiva or Sameach asked Shlomo Zalman, what are the parameters of instituting a prayer service for individuals who are not observant? Obviously, it's going to take place on Shabbos, and to bring them back to Judaism. Now, for reasons which are unclear, this truth, if you take a look at footnote 13, this response is omitted in subsequent editions of the Mincha Shlomo. It's in the first edition of Shlomo Zalman's Tshuvos, but then somebody removed it. It's extant elsewhere, but not in Mincha Shlomo. So evidently, somebody, I don't know who, somebody had a problem with this tshuva and decided it's too controversial, they're going to remove it from the Sefer. Okay, so what's wrong with the tshuva? Well, nothing's wrong with it, chas v'shalom. I think tshuva is fantastic, but somebody later on obviously decided they're going to remove it. Okay, so Shlomo Zalman introduced something which Reb Moshe never takes into account, which is the question of a tinok shenishba. What is a tinok shenishba? So we have, he quotes the Malamin, the whole of David Zvi Hoffman, who's a famous German plastic of the late 19th, early 20th century, who takes the position, which later was adopted by many poskim, that people who are Machal Shabbos in our time are to treat as tinokot shenishbu. What's a tinok shenishba? A child who was taken to captivity in an early age and doesn't know anything about Judaism. There's a whole perek in Masechet Shabbos about the the beginning of the 7th perek of Shabbos is about the status of a tinok shenishba. A child who was raised in captivity. Either he doesn't know about Shabbos altogether, or he doesn't know anything about the halachas of Shabbos. So this kid, tinok shenishba, has special parameters in halacha. So most poskim hold, not all poskim, most poskim hold that people who are not from today, people who are not Shomer Torah mitzvahs, have a status of a tinok shenishba. Now the Chazon Ish, he doesn't speak. I don't bring down the Chazon Ish here for some reason. I should have, but the Chazon Ish has a parallel discussion. Chazon Ish there's a halacha in the Gemara in Pesach Sanhedrin about a min, somebody who deliberately violates the prohibitions. And the Gemara discusses that the halacha status is either, depending on how severe it is, either lo moridin v'lo malin, or even moridin v'lo malin, meaning that you can't kill him outright, but you can either, if he's already in a pit, you can remove the ladder. And sometimes you can even, so he can't get out, and sometimes, in severe cases, you can entice him into the pit, and then remove the ladder so he can't get out. So you can cause the death of such a person. So the Chazon Ish says, this halacha doesn't apply b'zman hazeh. Because we don't have any true minim anymore. We don't have any true heretics. Why? Because to be a true heretic, he says, you need to live at a time when there was a Beis HaMikdash, when there was Gilui Shekhinah, there was divine revelation, when there was Ruach HaKodesh. Chazal, even though they didn't have prophecy, they were mishtamish v'baskol. They could communicate with the heavens. So then, at that time, you could, as somebody who denied the existence of God or the divinity of Judaism, the Torah, that was a real heretic. And that person might have been a Moredim Lo Malin or Lo Moredim Lo Malin, whatever. The point is that nowadays they don't have that anymore.
He's not considered a maestas?
What?
Someone like that's not considered
And he's not actively trying to persuade others.
I thought he's a heretic.
He's a heretic for himself. Okay, so I think for himself. He himself eats at McDonald's. He eats at McDonald's lahachis, but he's not trying to get other people to follow his example. That'd be something else, right? So the Chazon Ish holds there's no din of moredim below malim b'zman hazeh. Right? We don't have that halacha because we don't have that status, and that is usually understood to be the same parameter as tinok shenishba. In other words, which would mean even if somebody's born from, right? They were born Shem Torah mitzvahs, but then they went off the derech because of whatever dysfunctionality. Often it happens because you had a rebbe who messed you up. That's at least been my experience in chinuch. So you went off the derech because the rebbe who messed you up. It's not your responsibility. You went up. Okay, it is of course your responsibility to a certain extent, but Judaism did not shine its great light at you the way it could have, the way it should have. So therefore, you have diminished responsibility. That could be a definition of tinuk shenishba, right? That's usually most people's working definition of Torah shenishba, and Rav Shlomo Zalman is dealing with a similar parameter here. So he's saying that these people who they grew up ignorant of Judaism, including the laws of Shabbos, are not as guilty if they're Mechal Shabbos as a person who does fully know and observe Shabbos. Okay? Now, and then he says, you know what? And also, so that's one thing. First of all, the people have diminished responsibility. Now, in the 1950s, it was much harder to say this because a lot of people were then at the time came from Europe, and they were raised in an Orthodox environment, and then they left it. They came to America. They couldn't withstand the pressure. They went to work on Shabbos. As you probably know, the whole concept we have to have Ashkama Minyan originates from the early 20th century, where the Jews had to go to work on Shabbos. So they needed Ashkama Minyan, so they could go to daven in shul before they went to work. That's how Ashkama Minyan originated. So the pressures on the average American Jew were unbelievable. By the way, I have to tell you something, a shocking thing, which is in one of my other more recent articles for the Contemporary Society. I wrote an article about Shomer P'soim Hashem and coronavirus. So in that article, I quote the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish this is stunning. This is almost the most radical thing I've seen in my life. The Chazon Ish writes that about the parameters of Pikuach Nefesh. What's considered to be Pikuach Nefesh or not? And he says Pikuach Nefesh is very, very subjective. And he says there was once a rabbinical convention in Lithuania, in Poland actually, in the mid-1920s. And the purpose, at that time they had nationalized the tobacco industry. And the government wanted everybody to work on Shabbos, making cigarettes. And the Jews also, many of them employed in this industry, and they were supposed to be working in the factories on Shabbos. So this rabbinic convention is called in order to issue a statement saying that a Jew has to quit his job in order to avoid working on Shabbos. And they asked the Chofetz Chaim to sign on this announcement. Chofetz Chaim refused. Chofetz Chaim said, I can't sign on such an announcement because who knows if there might be a Jew whose parnasa is so stretched and so difficult that if I make him quit working on Shabbos, he's going to commit suicide. I can't sign because I might be causing the death of somebody from its pikuach nefesh to have a job on Shabbos. Now, why is this such a shocking statement about the Chofetz Chaim? Because we all know about Reb Moshe and about the Jews, what he said about and about all the Jews who came and kept Shabbos in America despite having to lose their job every Friday, and how Reb Moshe speaks about, they should have done it with simcha, not with a krechts, then their kids would remain from. But in any event, all this America is replete. If you read All for the Boss and all those popular books, which are, I don't know if it's still popular today, but it was popular when we were kids. But if you read these books, you see everybody's all the stories on the serious nefesh to give up your job every Erev Shabbos, So, and yet here, a law came to Chofetz Chaim and said, no, it might be pikuach nefesh. I can't force somebody to give up their job. This is an amazing statement. Okay, so, and again, as I say, that's very radical. But the point is that people knew that to go to work on Shabbos, that working on Shabbos was wrong, and they did it anyway. Okay, so that was the situation back then, and whether it was justified or not, we normally assume it's not justified. The Chofetz Chaim is very radical, and providing a basis saying perhaps it is justified. But in any event, people were not coming at the time. People were not going to do tshuva. It was not possible. They had to work on Shabbos. There were no jobs for people who didn't work on Shabbos. So in the 1980s, things are different. In the 1980s, in Or Samech, in Yerushalayim, the reason they want people to come to daven on Shabbos is because they want to be makarev them. Back in the 1950s, those shuls in Detroit and Louisville, which wanted to make a prayer service on the Sabbath, it wasn't that they should become frum. It said they should have a meeting on Shabbos and shul, right? But nowadays the reason is very different. Today, when you invite they make a Shabbaton. They make an NCSY convention, something like that on Shabbos. The point is to try and get people to do tshuva.
You have the same problem.
What?
The same issue that you're being Mechal Shabbos and like it's kind of a joke.
So Shlomo Zalman said there are 4 conditions here, which can be permitted. If you turn to page 7, I don't think this is the actual draft I submitted because my 4 conditions became 5 and number 2 is blank. But this is these are the 4 conditions. Number 1. It is permissible to invite an individual who lives at a distance from the prayer service's location, as long as he is offered a place to stay over Shabbos that is within walking distance of the prayer service. So that way, it's not really favor because you gave him an out. You say, "Listen, you invite for all of Shabbos." Okay. What? A rabbanan might be a problem, but we're going to get there. Once the offer is made, even if the individual declines the offer, it's not necessary to tell him to refrain from attending the prayer service. Moreover, it's not necessary to tell him that he may not arrive by car. You have to make the offer for him to stay. What happens afterwards is not your cheshbon anymore. And again, we'll come back to why it's not your cheshbon in a few moments. Number 2, says here 3, but 2, the parking lot location which the prayer service takes place must be closed throughout Shabbos and Yom Tov. So you're clear? Right. You're sending a clear signal. No driving. Right? Number 3, it is preferable not to. This is a bit of a chiddush. It's preferable not to count to an individual who still desecrates the Shabbos in public, towards the quorum of 10 men towards a minyan. I once asked a question to Rabban Soloveitchik when I was living in Chicago, and he said his psak, which I think is actually more normative today in America, although I'm not 100% sure, is that anybody who believes they're davening to Hashem can be a part of a minyan, even in Mechal Shabbos, because the point of being a part of a minyan is you're davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here, like we say on Erev Yom Kippur, you could say maybe we only say Yom Kippur. B'shiva Shemal, B'shiva Shemato, Das HaMokam, Das Gol, Olam Atim Lispalim Avaryonim. Okay, maybe only then. I think that I think the Satmar Rebbe said, okay, the Chelbana is in the Ketores, but it's the 11th Samimon. It's not part of the minyan, right? Chelbana, which represents the people who are of Ravera, you don't make the part of minyan. So okay, it's not clear. Obviously, they're studying the Khan, and many folks can hold that you can't join a Mechal Shabbos with Pharesia. Somebody who publicly desecrates the Shabbos as part of the minyan, but and that's what Shlomo Zalman is saying here. It's preferable not to. Again, I think if you're in a pinch, the psak from Rabban Soloveitchik is that as long as they believe they're davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you can join it for a minyan, count them towards a minyan. But regardless, Shlomo Zalman says, so long as there's a quorum of 10 people who observe the Shabbos present, not including those who will desecrate the Shabbos in public, it is permissible to grant aliyos to the individuals who do not observe the Shabbos, and also allow them, those of them who are Kohanim, to give Birkas Kohanim when Birkas Kohanim is done. Okay, so that was Shlomo Zalman's psak, and I think the reason it was taken out of the Mincha Shlema, but whoever took it out, is because it's very lenient, at least from Eretz Yisrael Charedi Dika perspective, right? That regardless people to know Kishnishbu, we're going to allow them to come to on Shabbos to this prayer service, and we're even going to allow them to get aliyos and participate in Birkas Kohanim, etc., etc.
Does this apply also to people who are religious that want to there? The Tinuk Shnishba is...
Anybody? So again, as I said, most we're going to see in a moment Rav Vosner disagrees, but most poskim hold that bisman is that anybody goes off the derech is a tinuk shenishma. Yeah, because somebody is off who's not tinuk shenishma is called yodeas ribono mechaven limrobo. They know their master and they intended to rebel against them. You don't have people like that nowadays. That's very rare. Okay, so
Moshe wasn't around?
what?
Moshe wasn't around at this time?
Reb Moshe was no longer alive in 1988. No, he was lived in 1986. But in any event, this question was asked in Eretz Yisrael. So I don't know if it would have been asked for Moshe anyway. Okay, Reb Shlomo Zalman was more the Mara Das of Eretz Yisrael than Reb Moshe. Okay, now in the footnote here on page 8, I have a discussion of what the Lubavitcher position is, because Lubavitcher's faces left and the right. Obviously, if you have a Chabad outside of town, then you have this big problem. Seder, right? Imagine you have the Chabad house in Bangkok. Everybody, thousands of people every Shabbos who are driving to your shul. So it's interesting that there are two tshuvas, so to speak, two letters written by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe and the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rayatz and the Reb Menachem Mendel. And in the footnote we have there on page 8, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe said, do not cancel the public classes on Friday night because the worry maybe someone will drive. Rather, since he knows people will drive, he should figure the Chabad Shliach. He should figure out a way to teach them the prohibition about it and encourage them to stop desecrating the Shabbos. And then in the letter from the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, he says, as to how to remedy what occurred in Simchas Torah, and among the participants in the Akafas of Yeshivas Ole Yosef Yitzchak. Bear in mind, again, these letters are in the 1950s, but in 1950, 1957. But Lubavitch, even in the 1950s, was doing Kiruv. They're probably the only ones doing Kiruv in the 1950s. So it says here, the remedy is simple. It's astonishing that it was not carried out this year. In other words, several days before the holiday, notices should be placed in the newspaper stating that it's definitely obvious and well known that it's forbidden to drive by car on Shabbos and the holidays, and that it's paradoxical to participate in a Torah event in a manner which is antithetical to Torah. So the way Lubavitch, they're supposed to handle it, not all of them do handle it this way, and it's a big issue what exactly Lubavitch holds today, is that they should tell people to come, and if they come, they come. Right, and which very often happens, right? You tell somebody, it's us to come on Shabbos, but if you're in Bangkok or in Mumbai, then you might come and show you. It's quite likely to come on Shabbos anyway. So that is a way officially Lubavitch treats the issue. Okay, so now we're going to come to Rav Vosner, and Rav Vosner has his difference with Shlomo Zalman on two accounts. Now, bear in mind before we come to Rav Vosner, till now we've been speaking about communal events. We haven't been speaking about one-on-one. In other words, till now I've been speaking about inviting somebody to a prayer service on Shabbos. I haven't been speaking about inviting somebody to lunch on Shabbos, where nobody's going to drive. Okay, that's something which we have to discuss, obviously. Is there a difference? And there should be a difference between the two. So Rav Vosner writes, first of all, and this is a very, very standard position taken by, I hate the term Haredi, and I hate the term right wing, but just for identification purposes only, by right wing Haredi poskim. But it's the position taken that there are no such thing as tinokos shenishbu b'zman hazeh, even b'zman hazeh, unless they grew up on a desert island, right? They grew up with no access to Judaism. If their parents gave them any access to Judaism, they're not tinokos shenishbu, which means, according to this, there's almost no such thing in Eretz Yisrael as a tinok shenishba. According to this perspective, because they all have some access to Judaism, they're taught some Tanakh in school, they see Orthodox Jews, so therefore, according to Rav Vosner, almost nobody's a tinok shenishba. Right? So this is it's going to be a very, very different position than the one taken by Shlomo Zalman. And that's he says only people who are whose children is on page 8 raised in an environment of non-Jews, which you remain in the middle of the Soviet Russia or something like that, or of Jews who cast off the yoke of Torah mitzvos, raised in a very high anti-religious kibbutz, those children who never heard, neither heard of nor accepted ever Torah mitzvahs or the primary principles of Judaism, they can be Tinoch Shenishbu. But if you grew up even in the middle of Tel Aviv, so then he wouldn't be Tinoch Shenishbu because there's a shul around the corner. So you know about Judaism. Okay, so obviously according to this, you would be a person who you invite for Shabbos, who's normally a Chol Shabbos, is considered to be as severe Machal Shabbos as a frum person who decides to get in the car and drive to the house on Shabbos. Because he's not a Tinoch Shenishba. A Tinoch Shenishba, we say they have diminished responsibility. But if you hold everybody who knows about Torah and Judaism, even they weren't raised that way, it's not a Tinoch Shenishba, so then you have a problem. You can't invite almost anybody, right? So therefore he says, Rav Wosner writes that it's forbidden to issue a Shabbos invitation to a person that's raised Shabbos if his clear will drive to the location to which he is invited. And so sometimes it's lifted even the Raisa, and sometimes it's a Mesei over the Rabbanon. But it's also. And he says that besides the issue of leaving even, there's the issue of Chil Hashem. And so, in other words, he holds that if you invite somebody to come on Shabbos, he's going to drive on Shabbos. That's a Chil Hashem. So therefore, it's a Lifnei Iver, Messiah. It's very, very unlikely that it's ever going to be mutter to invite, whether individually or part of an individual event or part of a collective event, anybody to come on Shabbos to an event if you know they're going to drive on Shabbos. Okay, so now let's come out. Let's go now to page 10 and discuss a bit. On page 9, a couple other things. Rav Wosner writes, but all right, we'll just do that. Okay, so on page 10. So now, there's another very important factor here, which is important to understand everything which we've spoken about, which is Shlomo Zalman has a very, very famous tshuva, which was not cut out of Minchas Shlomo, about the parameters of Lifnei Iver. So before we get to that, I want to jump ahead a minute and to go to the story which I have in a footnote on page 13, about an apocryphal story. So there's a story they tell about the Chazon Ish, which is probably not true, as it says in the footnote, that in 1952 was a very famous meeting between Ben Gurion and the Chazon Ish.
It's probably not true, you said?
Probably not true. It says why in the footnote. Ben Gurion came to visit Chazon Ish, and evidently several major agreements concerning the future of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, specifically vis-a-vis the army, who's going to be drafted, who's not going to be drafted, were ironed out at that meeting between Ben Gurion and the Chazon Ish. But according to the legend, the Chazon Ish was in a quandary. Ben Gurion was not showing Torah mitzvahs. Can he put a bowl of fruit or a piece of cake, whatever the case may be, on the table or not? So, if you put it, normally if you have a guest, we want to be mechabed him, give him something to eat, right? Okay, but somebody who's a regular person maybe can ask them to make a bracha. But Ben Gurion, first of all, he was understood to be anti-religious, but even more so, it's a chutzpah. The Prime Minister of Israel is coming to the table and going to say to him, and you need favors from him. You're going to say make a bracha? So what are you going to do? You're going to put out the food and ask to make a bracha, or not put out the food and look like you are not a proper host?
Did he have him in Zina? When he
so again, according to the story, the Chazon Ish didn't want to do that because he felt also that degrading to the Prime Minister. No, but I'm saying he obviously felt that according to the story, he felt that would also be perhaps an affront to the Prime Minister. So according to the way the legend goes, what he did is that he put out on the table this bowl of fruit, but he put it out of arm reach of Ben Gurion. And he knew it's pasnish, it's not appropriate for a Prime Minister to say, pass me an apple. So that way, he covered all bases, because the fruit was on the table, but Ben Gurion is not going to ask for it, because it's out of arm's length, and therefore he has no problem with making a bracha. Now, why do I say it's probably not true? Because Ben Gurion himself, I put that in footnote, says, you know what? I would want to meet the Chazon Ish, and we met across a bare table. There's something on the table. So I guess perhaps Ben Gurion didn't notice the fruit was so far away. He didn't notice the fruit was on the table. But in any event, That's the way the Ben Gurion didn't remember that there was food on the table. So now, but the Shlomo Zalman discusses this, and he doesn't bring down the apocryphal story, but he says, listen, you have a guest coming to your house, whoever it is, a business associate, a friend, a relative. What do? Do you put a fruit on the table? Don't put a fruit on the table. Do you give them something to eat or don't give them something to eat? A cup of coffee. So Shlomo Zalman says an amazing thing. Now let's read inside on page 10. This is my translation. In that which every person must assess his conduct, direct his deeds for the sake of heaven. These are my thoughts concerning the case of a person who is visited by a distinguished guest who does not observe Torah mitzvahs, but still harbors the love of Torah true Jews, and also supports Torah institutions, etc., whom the host knows will not make a blessing on his own over the food. Moreover, if the host asks his guest, even in a dignified manner, to wash his hands and recite a blessing, the guest will perceive the request as an affront and an insult to his honor. He'll become very annoyed. And on the other hand, if on account of the prohibition against giving food to someone who will not wash and pronounce a blessing, a guest, his host does not conduct himself with the common courtesy of offering his guest something to eat and drink, it's possible that the guest will, heaven forfend, come even more distant from Torah. Moreover, as a result, he may become angry and hateful towards all those who walk in the Torah's ways. In such circumstances, I believe that in truth it is proper for the host to honor the guest with food and drink. The host need not concern himself with the prohibition of lifnei iver. For although we do not instruct the person to commit a minor violation so as to save other persons from a major prohibition, nevertheless, this case is unique, since the only prohibition preventing the host from honoring his guests with food and drink is the potential sin of placing a stumbling block before him, lifnei iver. But a host who does not honor his guests with food and drink will cause the guest to commit an even greater violation. Well, he said in the footnote I bring down here, that Shlomo Zalman later says that the prohibition of lo sisla sachicha bilvavecha. One could call Chol Hashem, but it's lo sisla specifically. If you don't give him eat and drink, everyone's going to say, what kind of jerk is this host? This from Jew. What kind of he has a mitzvah doesn't even know how to fulfill it. So therefore, he says, accordingly, by honoring the guests with food and drink, the host commits no violation. Since in extending the food and drink, he is not placing a stumbling block before the guest. On the contrary, by actively placing a smaller stumbling block before him, the host is saving the guest from a very great stumbling block. So the truth is, a lot of Pesachim with Shlomo Zalman, I love Shlomo Zalman. A lot of Pesachim with Shlomo Zalman, after you read them, you think, why didn't I think of this myself? His genius is such that he comes up with things which, after you read them, you think they're so obvious. I should have thought of them. I never thought of them. And he's right. But if I don't give this person to eat and drink, I'll get a much bigger lifnei iver than giving him to eat and drink, and he shouldn't make a bracha. A bracha is d'rabbanan. You don't make a bracha, okay. You don't fulfill the mitzvah d'rabbanan of making a bracha. The mitzvah of making a bracha. But those things are achila bilvavecha and chil Hashem. Those are doraisas, right? You are causing this person to hate Torah Jews. You're making a chil Hashem. That's much, much worse than his not making a bracha. So it says Shlomo Zalman, if you have a guest who actually might be insulted if you don't give him food, and if you make him ask a bracha, so of course you give him food. You don't have to make a bracha. It's a davar pashut.
Moshe would disagree, though, no?
What?
Moshe would probably
I know Moshe would disagree. Well, we know that's quite possible.
It's the same idea, meaning and that if by not having people come to shul, they're going to intermarry.
Right, it's possible, but I'm going to come back to that. I do speak about it afterwards. Possible, but I have a suggestion about that. Okay, so and he does bring a similarity to a different Chazon Ish, not the one which you mentioned before, but a different Chazon Ish. Now it's page 11 at the bottom. The Chazon Ish is about there's a rule which prohibits certain forms of commercial activity with a person who is suspect not to keep the laws of Shemitah. And the specific law in question he talks about is that it's not permitted to sell wine barrels to a person who's engaged in commerce of wine that has been illegally hoarded during Shemitah, which is called Meshumar, and because of Lifnei Iver. So it says it's only if you know for sure that he's involved with commerce of wine which is inappropriate during Shemitah, of wine which is not made hefker, which is Meshumar. But if he's only chashud, he's only suspect of being involved in such activity, then you're allowed to sell wine barrels, right? And this holds true even when if the odds are, since he's dealing with such a large amount of wine, that for sure, the odds are for sure he's using. It's kind of a oxymoron there. Odds are for sure, but it means the odds are very great that he is dealing in forbidden wine. Yet nonetheless, you're allowed to sell him the barrels as long as there's the least smidgen of doubt. You don't know for sure that he's doing commerce in Shemitah fruit. And the Chazon Ish says a similar idea to what Shlomo Zalman says. Chazon Ish says, this is on page 12, that if we were to be stringent in such circumstances, we'd be putting a stumbling block in place for ourselves and for others, for we would be curtailing our mutual benevolence and our mutual sustaining of the lives and of the peace of our brethren who are engaged in commerce, who are at worst Amei Oretz, whom we are obligated to sustain and treat with benevolence, and certainly not to bring to greater detestation and animosity. Curtailing commerce in these circumstances would bring both sides, to violate lo sisna, right? The prohibition to detest another Jew. And other prohibitions that are no less severe than the prohibition of leave error, we're trying to prevent. So therefore, Chazon Ish says, Chazal calibrated this. They said, as long as there's that smidgen of doubt, maybe he's not doing shiur and perish feast, not being involved in commerce, in forbidden Shemitah fruit, you're allowed to sell them the proper tools they need for their activity. It's very similar to what Chazal say, that an Am Oretz is not believed to say his wine and other stuff is tahor, except during the regalim, because during the Shlosh regalim, when all Jews came together, it caused tremendous strife and animosity. If you told an Am Oretz, I can't trust your wine.
Also the base of English.
What?
Also the base of English.
Yeah. Right. They could bring it base of English, and we bring it as a korban, right? As a nesachim. So that's precedent, and it's very similar to what Shlomo Zalman is saying. Chazal themselves said, you know what? Even things which could be d'oraisos in the base of Mikdash, we accept the give them and bonus to give them credibility during regalim, because sinas chinam is the worst thing. To cause sinas chinam is Shlomo Rav Wolbe writes, one of the greatest Yetzer Haras in the world, one of the worst, is the Yetzer of frumkeit. So he says, frumkeit means, what's frumkeit mean? It means it gives me a thrill to be holier than you. So that is a tremendous Yetzer Hara, which many of us succumb to numerous times daily. So the idea is that if frumkeit can lead you to destroy somebody else's life and to make a tremendous chil Hashem, you have to be very careful, right? Even if you want to machmir, in certain cases, is extraordinarily dangerous. And when it has to do with making chil Hashem, he has to be very, very careful. Now, so that's what Shlomo Zalman, and that means that if, let's say, l'maisa, if you have a case where I'm not passing here actually l'maisa, but I'm hypothesizing. If you ask me l'maisa, I'll answer you l'maisa. I can't give a blanket psak, which is that if you have a relative, you're about tshuva, and you have a parent who's not true, or you have a child who went off the derech, and you know they're going to drive to your house on Shabbos, you're not going to invite them. If you don't invite them, they're going to go further away. They're going to hate you, and they're going to hate Yiddishkeit even more. You're going to lose them, right? So then, according to Shlomo Zalman, there's a cheshbon here. You always have to take it into account. It's not a simple matter to say it's usher.
But those are two dear rices now.
Right?
Now you know.
Right? Even that's what I'm saying. Not giving halacha l'maisa psak, because obviously there are other issues involved, and each case is separate. And of course, you have to always provide that they should be able to stay with you over Shabbos. In other words, not that you're inviting them outright to be Mechal Shabbos. But there are always eitzes. right? In each case, we find an eitzah, a loophole. Judaism, we're the religion that brought you loopholes, right? Rivas is us, and we gave you heteriska, right? Shmita is us, and we gave you proofs. Well, don't worry, we'll find something for you. But they have to be careful, right? It has to be the right loophole, the right place. So that's why I'm going to want to give a blanket sock. So in any event, but I wanted to say, and this comes back to what you asked me before, and this is the final point in this article on page 13, that let us put two cases addressed Rav Moshe in the proper context. Why Rav Moshe might not argue with Shlomo Zalman. The prevailing conditions in America in the 1950s, well before the advent of systematic attempts to bring Jews who are distant from observance to Torah and mitzvos, kiruv v'chokim, this didn't exist at the time. There's no mass kiruv. It's interesting. Rabbi Kaplan was one of the major participants in the kiruv movement when it arose, mostly in the 60s when things like NCSY and other tools of the trade became common. Moreover, let us revisit the circumstances of both inquiries. The situation in which the entire purpose of the prayer service in question was to promote and popularize prayer. There was no thought to use these services as stepping stones towards greater commitment and observance. Indeed, as Rav Moshe notes, by placing the value of these prayer services above the value of prayers of Sabbath observance, the implementation might be regarded as a form of proselytization away from Torah Judaism. And of course, there, if the Aver gets involved. The case addressed by Rav Wozner might also be placed in the context. The circumstances he describes are those of social invitations, not invitations issued with the intent of bringing the guests to greater commitment and observance. On the other hand, the case described by Shlomo Zalman's former responsum with the explicit purpose of the prayer services to serve as a stepping stone towards greater commitment and observance. Manner similar to that described by the Chazish of Shlomo Zalman carefully balances the reduction of the probability of a violation taking place by the offers of a place to stay over Shabbos, thus downgrading a definite lifnei to a suffix, doubtful one, with the concern of potential of committing a greater opposite lifnei by alienating the not yet observant individual by pressing the issue. Moreover, since the purpose of the invitation is to bring the participants to the prayer service to the Torah and mitzvos, such invitations, even according to Moshe, cannot be regarded as masis, as proselytizing away from observance, but towards observance. And the same rule of thumb would apply even to individual invitations to Shabbos meals. If they're intended for a purpose to bring those who are invited to Torah mitzvahs, or at least they shouldn't get further away from Torah mitzvahs, then offer a place to stay, and offer the place to stay in Shabbos extend to them. They would not be desecrations of Hashem's name, as perhaps otherwise it'd be, but rather sanctifications of God's Hashem's name, Kiddush Hashem, leading ultimately to enhance Sabbath observance. And I think that is again, every case has to be poskined individually, but there are possibilities of designing the invitation, if it's really given l'shem, making a person from hating Orthodox Jews in a way which will make it mutter. And although, as I write in the final footnote here, it's not brought up by the authorities, which we cite, but I think it's the Pasha it's relevant. There's a principle of Chalel of Shabbos Achas Kadeshi Shmor Shabbos Sarbe. That's the point of Pikuach Nefesh. Sometimes, and of course, again, there's not a blanket heter, but we have to teshbin. Sometimes, as well, there is a certain Shabbos which we have to countenance in order that eventually Shmir Shabbos will be enhanced. Shkoyach, thank you all for coming.
I got to go.